The goal of this lecture is to introduce the RSA public key cryptosystem. The concept of public key cryptography was invented by Diffie and Hellman in 1976, and it was a revolution in the field. Now, each user has two keys, a public key that is made public and a private key that is kept private. Of course, it should be hard to compute the private key from the public key. So every user will apply a key generation function that generates those two keys. And with public key cryptography, we can do many things. We can do public key encryption, digital signatures, key exchange, identification, and many other things. As we will see, public key cryptography solves the problem of key distribution. Assume, for example, that Alice and Bob have never met before. How can they communicate securely? This seems actually impossible, because if Bob transmits his secret key through some insecure channel, then the attacker will learn it, and there will be no privacy. So it seems in principle impossible for two persons who have never met before to communicate securely. But this is actually possible thanks to public key encryption. With public key encryption, Bob will use the public key of Alice to encrypt a message M. He will obtain a ciphertext that he can transmit to Alice through an insecure channel, and Alice will be the only one who can decrypt this ciphertext to recover the original message thanks to her private key that corresponds to her public key. So the RSA algorithm was the first public key algorithm. It was invented in 1977 by Rivest, Shamir, and Haldeman. And so, as we will see, it implements a trapdoor one-way permutation. And it is used for encryption and signature. So it's widely used to secure the internet and the email and many other applications. So RSA implements a trapdoor one-way permutation. So what is a trapdoor one-way permutation? It's a permutation such that computing f of x from x is easy, but recovering x from f of x is hard without knowing the trapdoor. And so from this, we can implement a public key encryption scheme, because anybody can compute the encryption C of f of m from the message M, but in the other direction, to recover the message M from the ciphertext C, we can only do this if we know the trapdoor, that is the private key. So how does it work? First, I'm going to describe the key generation of RSA. So we first generate two large prime P and Q of the same bit size. We compute their product, n equals P times Q, and the Euler function of n equals P minus 1 times Q minus 1. We also select a random integer e between 1 and phi of n, which is coprime with phi of n. And then, using the extended Euclidean algorithm, we compute the modular inverse of e modulo phi of n. That is, we compute the unique integer d such that e times d is congruent to 1 modulo phi of n. D is unique modulo phi of n. The public key is then n, the modulus n, and the public exponent e, and the private key is the private exponent d. Now, to encrypt a message M, we assume that the message is an integer between 0 and n minus 1, and using the recipient public key, so the pair n and e, we compute the ciphertext simply by raising the message M to the public exponent e, modulo n. So this gives us the ciphertext. And then to decrypt the ciphertext C, to recover the message M, we compute M equals C2D modulo n. So we see that anybody can encrypt because everybody knows the public exponent E and the public modulus, but only the owner of the private key can decrypt using the private key D. As I said, the message M is viewed as an integer between 0 and n minus 1. And actually, if we have a bit string of length strictly less than the bit size of n, we can always interpret such bit string as an integer less than n. So let me explain why RSA works. So first, we are going to remind you of Fermat's little theorem. So for any prime p and any integer a which is non-zero modulo p, we know that a to p minus 1 is congruent to 1 modulo p. And moreover, for any integer a, even equal to 0, we have a to p is congruent to a modulo p. So let's see why decryption works. So we must show that m to the power of e times d is congruent to m modulo n. So we know that e times d is congruent to 1 modulo phi of n. So there exists an integer k such that e times d is 1 plus k times phi of n, which is 1 plus k times p minus 1 times q minus 1. So we must show that m to the power of 1 plus k times p minus 1 q minus 1 is congruent to m modulo n. So we are going to check that it is true modulo p and modulo q, and then by CRT, it will be true modulo n. So if m is non-zero modulo p, then we know that by Fermat's little theorem that m to the power of p minus 1 is congruent to 1 modulo p, and which gives m to the power of 1 plus k times p minus 1 q minus 1 is congruent to m modulo p. And so this equality also holds for m equal to 0 modulo p. So we obtain that the initial equality is true modulo p for any message m. And similarly, it is of course also true for modulo q for any message m. And therefore, as I said, by the Chinese remainder theorem, if the two primes p and q are distinct, which should be the case, then m to the power of e times d is congruent to m modulo n. So therefore, when we decrypt, we really recover the original message. So we can also decrypt using the Chinese remainder theorem. So given the prime factors p and q of the modulus n, so instead of computing m equal as c to the power of d modulo n, we are going to perform the work modulo p and modulo q separately. So modulo p, we compute c to the power of dp modulo p, where dp is the private exponent d, but modulo p minus 1. And similarly, mq is c to the power of dq modulo q, where dq is the private exponent d, but this time modulo q minus 1. And then, using the Chinese remainder theorem, we find m such that m is both congruent to mp modulo p and to mq modulo q. And so we know that we can do this using this equality. M is actually equal to mp times the inverse of q modulo p times q plus mq times the inverse of p modulo q times p modulo n. And since exponentiation is cubic, this is actually 4 times faster than without the CRT. So how do we implement RSA in practice? So we must compute with very large integers, at least 1000 bits and maybe more. So in software, we are going to use a big integer library such as GMP, which is open source. And in hardware, for a smart card, we can use a crypto processor. And there also exists some hardware accelerators for PC. So one drawback of RSA is that it is actually relatively slow because we must deal with very big integers. So in particular, it is much slower than VAES and other block ciphers. So how do we proceed when we want to encrypt long messages? We actually apply an hybrid scheme. We first encrypt a randomly generated symmetric key K with RSA. So Bob is going to first generate a random key K, and then is going to encrypt this key K with RSA using the public key of Alice. So this gives the first part of the ciphertext, so C1. And Bob uses a block cipher, so for example AES, to encrypt the long stream of message M using this symmetric key K with the block cipher. And this gives us the second part of the ciphertext. So both parts are then transmitted to Alice. So Alice first decrypts the first ciphertext, C1, using her private key. So she recovers the symmetric key K, and then she can decrypt the long ciphertext, C2, using the same block cipher to recover the original message. So here we get the best of both worlds, because we get the flexibility of public key encryption, of RSA, and we get the speed of a block cipher. So how secure is RSA? So we see that the security of RSA is based on the hardness of factoring. So it should be difficult to recover the prime factors P and Q given the modulus. Actually, we don't know any efficient algorithm to factor integers. The best algorithms have sub-exponential complexity. And currently, the factoring record, which dates back to 10 years ago, is the factorization of a 768-bit RSA modulus. So in practice, one should use at least 1000-bit RSA and probably more, actually. But factorization is only one possible attack, and there are many other lines of attacks against RSA. So first, I will describe the basic attacks against textbook RSA. So textbook RSA is just the RSA that I have just presented. And there are more sophisticated attacks based on as we will see, on Coppersmith theorem. So the low private and low public exponent attacks. And there are also implementation attacks. So for example, timing attacks when we measure the running time, the power attacks when we measure the power consumption, and also fault attacks. So let me describe first the complexity of factoring. So the best factoring algorithm is the number field sieve, but it has sub-exponential complexity. It's roughly exponential of n to the power of 1/3, where n is the bit size of the modulus. So when the modulus has n bits. And the current factoring record is, as I said, the factorization of a 768-bit RSA modulus. So we should use at least 1000-bit RSA modulus, and maybe more for long-term security, at least 2000 for long-term security. So one question is the hardness of breaking RSA compared to the hardness of factorings. Because for RSA, we are interested in actually a potentially simpler, easier problem, which is given the public key n and e, and given a challenge y, to find some x such that y is equal to x to e modulo n. So if we can solve this problem, then of course we can decrypt any message and RSA will be insecure. So one open problem is to know whether breaking RSA is actually equivalent to factoring. Because actually breaking RSA, solving this problem, could be easier than factoring. So what we know and what is easy to show is that knowing the private exponent d is actually equivalent to factoring. So it's well known. There is a probabilistic reduction, which was already mentioned in the RSA paper, and it's also possible to have a deterministic algorithm to solve the same problem, but it is actually unpractical. So let me describe some elementary attacks against textbook RSA encryption. So we have the very simple dictionary attack. If there are only two possible messages, M0 and M1, then there are actually only two possible ciphertexts, C0 and C1, that the attacker can compute by himself because he knows the public key. He knows the modulus n and the public exponent e. So therefore, if the attacker sees a ciphertext which is C0, then he knows that the plain text is M0, and if he sees C1, then the plain text is M1. So this shows that encryption must be probabilistic. So there must be many possible ciphertexts corresponding to a single plain text, so that this dictionary attack becomes impossible. So for example, in the old PKCS1 version 1.5 standards, the message was encrypted as follows. First, we pad the message with some 0 and some randomness R, which is long enough. And then this encoding is raised to the power of e modulo n. And to decrypt, we check that the encoding has the right format, and eventually we disclose the message M. But this is actually still insufficient. There was this Bleichen-Bascher's attack 20 years ago. So let me describe a different attack, which is still elementary. Now this is a chosen ciphertext attack. We assume that we have a ciphertext C to be decrypted, and we are going to ask for a decryption of not C, but a related ciphertext C prime. So what we do is we generate a random OR, and we ask for the decryption of a new ciphertext C prime, which is C times R to E modulo N. So the ciphertext C prime has a random distribution because R is random. And if we obtain the decryption of C prime, we obtain M prime, which is C prime to D. And by definition, this gives C to D times R to E to D. And R to E to D is actually the original random R. So this gives C to D times R, which is M times R. So now we can recover the original plain text M, which is M prime over R, modulo N. So this shows that the decryption of the ciphertext is related. Using from the decryption of C prime, we can obtain the decryption of C. And of course, this is a bad property because what we would like is that all decryptions are independent, that all ciphertexts are independent. Even if we can obtain the decryption of some ciphertext, this should not help us in decrypting other ciphertext. But the conclusion is very simple. We should not use textbook RSA encryption. So now I'm going to describe the correct way of encrypting with RSA. But first, we must specify what it means for an encryption scheme to be secure. And so I'm going to describe the main security notion for public key encryption. So what we would like is that from a ciphertext C, the attacker should not be able to derive any bit of information from the corresponding plain text. So the attacker should learn nothing from the corresponding plain text, assuming that the attacker does not know the private key. And this should be the case even if, as previously, the attacker can obtain the decryption of any other ciphertext except C, of course. And this security notion is called indistinguishability against a chosen ciphertext attack, and it is denoted in CCA2. So this is called indistinguishability because the attacker cannot distinguish between the encryption of two different plain texts. That is, the attacker learns nothing from the ciphertext. So what we do to prove that a scheme is secure, that an encryption scheme is secure, we prove that if an attacker was able to distinguish between the encryption of two plain texts, so if the attacker was able to break this in CCA2 property, then we could use this attacker to break RSA. And now, assuming that inverting RSA is hard, then this means that there can be no attacker who can break this security property, and so the public key encryption scheme will be secure. So let me explain the scenario and the security notion in more details. So initially, we assume that the adversary receives the public key. So this we cannot avoid because the public key is public. And then the attacker can make decryption queries for any ciphertext Y of his choice. And then at some point, the attacker can choose two messages M0 and M1 of the same length and is going to receive the encryption C of one of the two messages. So he receives the encryption of MB for a random bit B. And then the attacker can continue to make decryption queries, but this time the only restriction is that he cannot query the decryption of the ciphertext C that he has just received. And now the attacker must output a bit B prime, which represents its guess of B. And the goal of the attacker is to guess correctly. So to have B prime equals B. So to guess which message M0 or M1 has been encrypted. And then to formally define the security notion, we say that the encryption scheme is in CCA2 secure if for any attacker A which works in polynomial time, then the advantage of the attacker, which is defined at 2 times the probability that B primes equals B minus 1, this advantage should be a negligible function of the security parameter. So we define the advantage like that because we know that the adversary can always guess correctly with probability 1/2, simply by flipping a coin. So in that case, the advantage would be 2 times 1/2 minus 1 would be 0. So the advantage of the adversary measures the excess probability compared to 1/2. And we would like that this advantage would be as close to 0 as possible. So we ask that this advantage is a negligible function of the security parameter. So the first practical scheme to achieve this security property was OAP, designed by Bellard and Rogaway at Eurocrypt 94. So it provides the INCCA2 security in the random oracle model, assuming that RSA is hard to invert. And this OAP scheme is in the standard PKCS1 version 2.1. So OAP works as follows. To encrypt a message M, we first pad it with a string of zeros of K1 bits, where K1 is specified in the standard. And we generate a random OR, and then we apply the hash function G. So G and H are two hash functions, which are publicly specified. So we apply this function G to OR, and we XOR the result with M and the string of zeros. We obtain the first part C, the first part S, and then on S we apply the hash function H, and we XOR the result with OR to get T. And then to encrypt the message M, the encryption is the concatenation of S and T raised to the power of E modulo N. So this gives us the ciphertext C. And then to decrypt, we first raise C to the power of D, so we recover the concatenation S and T. Then we can apply the hash function H to S, and we XOR this with T, so we recover the random OR. Then we can apply the G function to OR, and we XOR it with S, and we obtain the message M and the string of 0. So we must check that we really have a string of K1 0. If this is not the case, we declare that the ciphertext is invalid. Otherwise, we would put the message M. So let me describe now the concept of digital signature. So what is a digital signature? A digital signature is a bit string that depends on the message M to be signed and the public key of the user. So to sign a message M, Alice will apply a signature function using a private key, and then she obtains the signature S. And then anybody can verify the correctness of the signature of Alice using her public key. So Bob will combine the public key of Alice, the message M, which has been signed, and in signature S, and the verification algorithm outputs yes or no. So yes means that the signature is correct. So we see that only Alice can generate the signature of a message M corresponding to her public key, because she's the only one who knows her private key. And then anybody can verify the correctness of the signature using the public key of Alice. So with RSA, we can do signatures. So the key generation is the same as previously. We still have this public key modulus N, which is the product of P and Q, where P and Q are large primes. So we still have the public exponent E and the private exponent D, such that D times E is 1 modulo phi of N. And now to sign a message M, the signer who knows the private key computes S equals M to D modulo N. So now only the signer can sign the message, because he's the only one who knows the private key. And then anybody can verify the correctness of the signature, because we check that M is equal to S to E modulo N. So this works because, as we have seen before, raising to D and raising to E are inverse operations. So if the signature has been generated correctly, then it will verify correctly. So there are many attacks on textbook RSA signatures. That's why textbook RSA signatures should not be used. So there is a simple existential forgery. So we can generate any random OR. If we raise OR to E, we obtain something and we declare that this is the message M. Of course, the message N will not contain any useful information, but still here we obtain a pair of message and signature, M and OR, that is valid. And without knowing the private key here, to do this, we only need to know the public key. And there is also a chosen message attack because we notice that if we compute the product of two messages, M1 and M2 raised to the power of D, this is the product of the signature of M1, M1 to D, and the signature of M2, M2 to D, modulo N. So if we already know the signature of M1, M1 to D, and the signature of M2, M2 to D, we can simply multiply them modulo N, and we obtain a new signature, the signature of M1 times M2. So again, maybe M1 times M2 does not make sense, but this is still a bad property because without knowing the private key, using only public information, we can create a new signature for a new message that has not been signed before. And this is called a forgery. And this is, of course, a bad property. So to prevent these attacks, we usually apply a hash function. So the message is first hashed, and then we can pad it with some constant. So we take the message M, we compute h of M, and we pad it with some string. And this is what is done actually in the PKCS1 version 1.5 standard, where we compute the SHA-1 hash function of M. We concatenate some constant that depends on SHA-1 and some other constants. And then the signature is sigma, is mu of M. So this previous encoding of M raised to the power of D modulo N. And then to verify the correctness of a signature, we raise sigma to the power of E, and we check that we recover exactly this encoding. So we hash the message M again with SHA-1, and we check that we obtain this mu of M. So in this lecture, I have introduced the RSA crypto system. So I have explained RSA encryption and what are the elementary attacks. I have introduced the INCCA2 security notion for encryption and the OAP public key encryption scheme based on RSA. I have also explained RSA signatures and described the elementary attacks. So in the next lectures, I will describe more complex attacks against RSA, and in particular, I will explain Coppersmith's technique. And in another lecture, I will also explain how to do security proofs for RSA signature schemes.